Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get yourself a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/sweetstorybro. With over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player, man, you're spoiled for choice with something to listen to. So I know what you're going to do as soon as this show is ended. You're going to head over to audibletrial.com/sweetstorybro and pick yourself up something free today.
Now hear this. The following podcast is likely to contain numerous instances of vulgarity or profanity, which some may deem inappropriate. If you're of an overly sensitive disposition, stop listening now. Additionally, the podcast will be filled with numerous spoilers throughout, so if you haven't had an opportunity to read, watch, or enjoy the story prior to this broadcast, please do so, before continuing with this episode of Sweet Story, Bro.
Get ready for action! 3, 2, 1, fight!
Hey, what's going on, guys? It's time for another episode of Sweet Story Bro with your friend writer Steve Russell, bringing to you the skinny on what's good, what's bad, what's geeky, and whether a story is worth your time every 2 weeks. That's bi-weekly for those that didn't know. Thank you so much for downloading this latest episode. I assume if you're subscribed, then it would have already just magically appeared on your podcast listening device. But if this is the first time that you are checking out one of my episodes to see if it is something you'll enjoy, thank you for downloading it and giving me your time. I genuinely, truly hope that you enjoy it and that it'll convince you to hit that subscribe button, man, because every subscribe matters, every like on every video or tweet or retweet, whatever, just to help get this show out there to new ears matters so much. And this is the third episode into the redux, the reformatting of the show, making it a lot more accessible, I hope, and I've got some really great feedback off of it. It seems like this is going to be the way to go going forward, and I hope you guys enjoy it. And of course, I'm always open to what you have to say, whether you like it or you don't like it, whatever. Let me know. Get in contact with me, because I will read everything you send, and I will try to respond to the best of my ability if and when you do. So don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher so that you never miss one. That's what we were just alluding to. If you enjoy this, hit subscribe. That way it magically appears on your device without you even having to do a thing. And then that way your commute is absolutely sorted. You can look at your screen and go, oh shit, Steve reviews, let's say Stranger Things, Steve reviews Stranger Things. I really want to know what this show is about, or I kind of want to know what he thinks about it. It's already there. You don't have to download it or do anything. Just connect it to your car, put in your headphones, whatever you do to listen to it. And let's talk about the geeky story. Let's talk about what's good, what's bad. And most importantly, let's talk about whether it's officially too sweet or officially just not sweet enough. And of course, you can hit up sweetstorybro.com to find all the links that you need in relation to the show. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, everything you need all in one place. And especially for the YouTube, where we're doing more and more sweet updates, bro. It seems like they're kind of working at it one a month right now, but that wasn't planned. That wasn't the game plan. It's just how it's fallen. Maybe some months there'll be more. Maybe there won't be some months, but you don't want to miss it. Some major updates come through that then I mentioned on Twitter after the fact. So you definitely want to be subscribed on YouTube. Everything you need all in one place, sweetstorybro.com, and that actually includes Amazon links for all your purchasing needs. So you don't get charged any more, not a penny extra. You pay the exact same price as what you would see on amazon.co.uk, but it kicks back a small percentage to your friend, Steve, the guy who's trying to write and trying to do more podcasts, create more content, and look at more things to share with you. Win-win-win all around, man. And you can access those links through sweetstorybro.com and clicking the Amazon links at the top. But why? Always with the why, man. Why this story? Why Duskfall by Chris Husberg? Well, I'll be completely honest here. I'll be completely candid. It's one of the first lot of books that was sent through to me to review, and this was via the fine people over at Titan Books over here in the UK. Lovely people to deal with. They sent me some review copies to read, which was very graceful of them, very nice of them to do. And it's taken me a while to get around to doing it because of the backlog of podcasts, the stories that I was committed to already reviewing, coupled with the reformatting of the show. It just took a little while. And I do apologize for that because Duskfall is actually available right now. So if you enjoy the sound of the story by the end of this review, check it out, man. Do buy those Amazon links on the website. The synopsis is what grabbed me, though. When I was looking through and I initially got in contact with them, the synopsis was very interesting when I first read it. And sometimes, that's enough to give something a go. It's not necessarily the same as judging a book by its cover, but you are taking that blurb, that condensed version of what the story is, or at the very, very least, that initial hook, that inciting incident that's meant to get its hooks into you, really caring about what's about to happen, what's about to go on, so that you turn the page. And every time you finish a page, you want to turn the next page just to see what's going to happen next. Now, the synopsis of this book, this is one thing of the new format that I felt it was important going forward. For those who are just checking out the episode perhaps out of curiosity, I thought it was important to include the synopsis just to give them an idea about what the story is going to be about. And of course, for those who are familiar, this is just simply retreading, that ground that you've already read. But it doesn't hurt anybody, and it helps to contextualize the story a little bit, so I hope that you guys appreciate or understand why I'm doing this. And to quote, and this synopsis is taken from Amazon, actually, amazon.co.uk, this is the synopsis of Duskfall, written by Chris Husberg. Quote, pulled from a frozen sea, pierced by arrows and close to death, Nott has no memory of who he was, but his dreams are dark, filled with violence and unknown faces. Winter, a tiellan woman whose people have long been oppressed by humans, is married to and abandoned by Nott on the same day. In her search for him, she will discover her control of magic, but risk losing herself utterly. And Cinzia, priestess and true believer, returns home to discover her family at the heart of heretical rebellion, a rebellion that only the Inquisition can crush. Their fates and those of others will intertwine in a land where magic and demons are believed dead, but dark forces still vie for power. End quote. One last thing that I think is really important to just note before we jump into the meat and potatoes of this review. Of course, please remember, everything is just my opinion. Everything is just one guy's opinion, one dude who wants to write, looking at what other people have created, and just assessing whether I think it's good or bad. That's all it is. It's just an opinion. So with that in mind, and coffee in hand, let's go. Now, a story can only be as compelling as the characters that fill it, of course, and I'm happy to say that the characters are, on the whole, all pretty likable, except maybe, and then for me, this is again all personal, I found Nott, the main character, the amnesiac Nott, to be moany and whiny, and I just didn't really connect with him as a character. And of course, he's one of the three major characters, apart from Cinzia and Winter. So that's a major issue, because there's 1/3 of your main protagonist that I'm already having an issue connecting with. And it's not because he's a bad guy. It's just because for the longest while he's painted with pretty broad brushstrokes. He's very, very 2D. I have amnesia. I'm capable of this amazing stuff, kicking ass, taking names. I don't know how I can do this. I don't know who I am or where I'm from. But I'm basically a fucking ninja. He's basically Jason Bourne, with the amnesia being dragged out the ocean and shit. And because of that, and because he didn't know who he was, it just felt very, very meh. Just boring. Nothing really to him. Oh, I don't know who I am, but how can I do this stuff? It freaks me out. I love the bloodlust, and that doesn't equal compelling for me personally. I think that he needed to be inflected with a lot more personal character traits as the story went on. And by the end, obviously, it all kind of wraps up, and we discover his secret and who he is, and most importantly, who made him. right? But just not as a whole. And you got some secondary and tertiary characters as well that I find less interesting. Honestly, I think the most underdeveloped third wheel of a character in the entire arc is Leanne, who is the tiellan who basically loves Winter. They grew up together as children until Nott came on the picture a year ago, and then they end up married before everything falls fucking apart. Their wedding is interrupted by these guys from Rodin, I believe it is. Rodin, because they speak Rodinese, and this is something that Nott remembers. But why would they crash the wedding in the first place? And that's what sets Nott off on his journey, abandoning Winter, his now wife, on the same day that he marries her because he considers himself too dangerous. He wants to know about his past, so he leaves her. He abandons her after they get married. And Leanne just has loved her, Winter that is, since they were kids. And despite this, he comes across as incredibly underdeveloped. That's the only major trait to him. I've loved you since we were kids. You have now fallen in love with Nott, because for the longest while, this sort of almost arranged marriage was a big point of contention in the story, where Winter didn't want to be with him and she didn't love him. And she was very open about this. I don't love Nott. By the end, that's a different story. But yeah, a couple of underdeveloped characters, a couple of annoying characters don't take away from the fact that the huge party that, makes up the rest of the cast of characters, especially by the end where all the stories converge and intertwine, are all pretty likable. Even, this is what I mean, even the lesser ones that don't get much page time come across quite likable in a very quick way that these characters, again, Leanne especially him, should have come across as. And straight away, I've got this quote from Chris Husberg, the author, talking about world building and character development. And it's taken from an interview with a fantasticallibrarian.com. And he says this, I quote, "The world building, composing histories, refashioning governments and religions, drafting geography, creating new magic systems is a lot of fun. But for me, I wouldn't be telling stories if it wasn't for characters. I start almost every story with a character. I base plot on how these characters develop, on the trials and problems and conflicts they face. For me, everything comes back to and originates with character. Those are the stories that have always been most compelling for me to read. So those are the ones I try to write." End quote. And like I say, for the majority of the people that he fills his story with, that is true, especially with the world building by the end and things like that. But it's just a bit of a shame that some of his most major characters are almost just a 2D pastiche. And you'd have to, obviously this review is spoiler-laden, but if you really want to get an appreciation of what I'm saying here, you're going to have to pick it up. But like I say, the characters on the whole are likable. Especially Astrid, who's an awesome character. And Astrid is a young girl, and she appears somewhat through the novel a little bit and teams up with Nott and introduces another layer and element to him by them having a relationship. Not like that, but obviously. Because she's a vampire. She's a vampire who inhabits the body of a 9-year-old girl. So forever young, but being over 300, 200 years old. They crack wise about this a little bit during their journey and stuff. But the one thing that kept coming to my mind in the way that I think that this relationship took influence from is something like The Road, or more prevalent, The Last of Us, the relationship that exists between Joel and Ellie. I find elements of that within Nott and Astrid. And if you want to know more about The Last of Us, American Dreams, that's an older episode that I review, albeit in the older style, but do check it out if you haven't already. It was a really good graphic novel, some cool art, although interesting art, done in the cartoony style. But is it officially too sweet or just not sweet enough? You'll have to listen to the review in order to find out, my friends. But Astrid, the vampire girl, old soul, 9-year-old body, she was probably one of the most compelling characters in here, always with a quip, quick-witted, funny, sarcastic. I know for a fact, based off the research I've done, that Chris is a massive Buffy fan, and I think he's distilled the majority of his Buffiness into this character, imbued Astrid with the spirit of Buffy. And I mean all of their characters, not just Buffy herself. I got this quote from him, taken from an interview with quillery.blogspot.co.uk, speaking on Astrid, and he has this to say, quote, Astrid, a young girl who shows up partway through the novel, was the easiest to write for, that is. Sometimes characters are so easy to write that they almost take over the story, and that was the case with Astrid. She's sarcastic, quippy, and is capable of surprising violence, and all of that makes for a pretty easy character to write, end quote. And you can really see that come through in how he chooses to write her. Just every scene that has her in it flows a little bit easier. You can just see that she's a preferred character. If he has an ability within the scene to defer to her, he usually takes it. And I think this is probably because he found her so compelling and easy to write, as you see from the quote there. Now, by the end of the book, right, this is another thing that I liked about it. By the end of the book, you finally have an understanding for each of the characters, and there are a few that you need to remember. I think the party at one point, is about 7. I think it caps out at 7, if not slightly more. That's 7 different characters, all with 7 different arcs, purposes, and reasons for being there. They all have backstories and lives that have led them to that moment. So how did they all get there? And the fact that you feel that you kind of know is a testament to Chris's good writing here. I mean, they all have purpose, and they're all imbued with agency. Which is, honestly, it can be a difficult thing for an author to achieve that. And the one thing it reminded me, and I really, really liked this, I later discovered during my research that he was a big fan of this series, but the whole party system, multiple characters somehow finding themselves on the same journey without necessarily meaning to, and teaming up and being together and relationships forming between them and camaraderie. It's so Final Fantasy, man. It really is. Final Fantasy 7, 6, 5, 8, 9, whatever. You throw a Final Fantasy number at me, it kind of has elements of that within this story. And I'm a big fan of that, actually. I really liked how that worked out. And as I was alluding to just a second ago, here's a fun fact about Chris Husberg that I found out in my research for him and for Duskfall, this first book within the Chaos Queen Quintet. That's 5, baby. 5. He is a big Final Fantasy fan, and he started writing in one of the most interesting ways. He began writing Final Fantasy VII fan fiction and getting into that scene, reading what other people have written within the fan fiction community, critiquing it, I would guess, enjoying it, not enjoying it, because God knows there's going to be a lot of bad fan fiction out there. And I just found it really interesting that that's how somebody would get into it. I've got a sort of similar backstory into how I began to really start creative writing, but I'm going to save that story, man. I'm not going to do that way here. Maybe one day, somebody will be researching me for a podcast they're doing on Temporary, and they'll find this quote, just in the way I found Chris Husberg talking about Final Fantasy fan fiction. But obviously for me, just him as a person, he comes across really cool. Chris Husberg, as an individual, seems like a really cool, geeky guy. He likes a lot of the same stuff that I imagine most of us like. If you're listening to this podcast and you enjoy what you've heard prior, chances are you're into the same sort of geeky things, and there's this massive Venn diagram of crossover interest. And I took this quote from civilianreader.wordpress.com, another interview that Chris did, talking about inspiration. And if you remember from my last episode, this was something I was actually very passionate on. And it's very interesting because of how it echoes what I had to say. And I quote Chris, "I'm certainly influenced by other media, and I'm both proud and grateful for those influences. Anything that's well written, films, television programs, video games, graphic novels, comics, and of course books inspires me. History inspires me. I'll be studying the Punic Wars extensively for Book 3 in the Chaos Queen Quintet. And ordinary people doing ordinary things, or heroic things, or tragic things, or unconscionable things inspires me too. That, for me, is part of the beauty of being a writer. Ideas and inspiration are everywhere." End quote. One more time, because of how it parrots what I said last week. And if you didn't hear it from my Stranger Things review, do check it out, because Stranger Things was a lot of fun to talk about. I think there's a lot to be taken from that show on a deeper level, and I think I touch upon it quite well in that review if you haven't checked it out yet. One more time, ideas and inspiration are everywhere. I couldn't agree more with that mindset, Mr. Chris Husberg. And I think you can see it in the way that you write. Again, his writing style is definitely imbued with all of these different flavors. You can see the sarcasm of Buffy. The way that he writes action is obviously taken from something else. Real life influences. He's a Mormon, for example, a Mormon Christian, and he imbues so much of his book with elements that he would obviously know or be familiar with through his own faith. I mean, I mentioned the action sequences just a second ago. I really can't stress this enough. The action sequences in this book are actually awesome. They're really well written, and they're filled with gravitas. Like, everything that happens in them, every movement, every action has real weight to it. And the end result of each battle, nobody leaves that battle the way they entered it. You know, they all lose something, a part of themselves. I think, honestly, one of the great themes of this book is loss of self, loss of who you are, loss of direction, whilst also trying to reassert that. Winter loses herself into her drug addiction, not literally has lost all semblance of who he is. Leon feels that he's lost his friend and longtime childhood girl who he loves. In Winter, there's so much loss within this first book, which is interesting because normally as a first, you want to leave things on a bit of a higher note, and this book certainly doesn't do that, which, you know, I'll talk upon in just a moment. But there are only a few major battles in the book, but I have to say they're all amazing. There's one midway through, and the finale is particularly memorable, actually. The lore of this world, right? The lore, when it's finally established, and I want you to remember that just for a second, when it's finally established, is intriguing. It's a large, expansive world that he's created here, rich with history and people and different cultures and, you know, wars and politics and struggles. And I'll honestly say, and I don't know if he didn't mention this one specifically in any of his interviews that I saw, but it reminded me of The Witcher somewhat. And I've only just begun to read the Witcher novels. I came through it all, of course, like most people, through the video games. I played The Witcher 3, absolutely fell in love with that game, and disappearing for hours at a time into different worlds that it had to offer. Then the books themselves are much in the same way. And I feel that Chris Husberg, I don't know if he's played it, I don't know anything like that, I can't comment on that, but it definitely has similarities to how that works, especially the political aspects of it. I mean, this book has plenty of interesting themes. I spoke about loss. That's just one of the major ones. And the themes that are tackled in this book, though, have been ones that have been touched on within numerous fantasy books, or dark fantasy, which is what this is. He considers this to be. Things like religion, faith, loss of faith, or crisis of faith, political struggles, etc., etc. These things have been done before. They've been done to death. One of the big ones, obviously, that you have to compare it to at this point would be the Game of Thrones. It's impossible to... I think it honestly is virtually impossible to compare any book within this genre now without thinking of Game of Thrones, which is almost unfair to everybody within that genre, including George R.R. Martin himself, I would say. But Chris Husberg has this to say on the concept of writing what you know in relation to world building. And this is taken from an interview from sffworld.com. And I quote, "While I've never been an assassin, vampire, or had access to magic of any kind, I have struggled with and felt the effects of faith crisis, addictions, and relationships in general. As a writer, I think it's almost impossible for me to stop my own life experiences from seeping into my characters and stories." End quote. Again, the concept of religion is one that is brought up so many times throughout Duskfall because one of its major characters is part of the Cantic denomination, which is this religion that exists within his world. You got 9 people, much like again Game of Thrones. I think you have the 7 in Game of Thrones, and over here you have 9. Different numbers for different origins, but it's interesting. One of my favorite things, and again, this is one of the themes within this book, is prejudice. And primarily prejudice towards Winter and her people, the Tiellans, who, to break it down quite quickly for you, are essentially elves but shorter than humans. So he's taking this trope of what elves are and kind of flipping on its head a little bit. Tiellans are almost like elves by way of dwarves, but neither. More closer to elves. In fact, elves is a derogatory term within this world. You call somebody an elf, it's like insulting them. And I actually really like that. I thought it was a really nice subverted idea of what we know as elves, taking the standard trope and twisting it ever so slightly to make it something new. I actually pulled this quote from the book itself, which helps to kind of color that a little bit, give it a little bit more context for the characters who are suffering with that prejudice. Quote, and this is actually, just to give a little context, this is Leon, keep doing that. This is Leon having a bit of a go at Winter about her belief in elves and their history, steeped in rich history, tiellans, because they used to be a proud people before they were overthrown and essentially enslaved by humans, and now they're a lesser people. Quote, you don't really believe that, do you? Next you'll claim the ancient tiellans lived 1,000-year lives and spoke with trees. All things from stories they'd been told growing up. Every tiellan knew them, but no tiellan truly believed them. End quote. Well, maybe so much time has passed that truth became legend. But I thought it was interesting, teasing the concept of what we know as elves, and this is thousands of years have passed since that, and so maybe we're just looking at a different point in time of the Earth history. I thought that was really nice, actually. A little bit of world building there, a little bit of culture defining for the tiellans. Now, once the story gets going, and I mean really after it's cranked itself into gear, it really, really hits its stride past the midway point, and it shifts that gear and becomes incredibly engaging. Once we get past that, and there's a major battle, and I think the pronunciation is Navone. Once you get past the Navone battle scene, and if you pick this up and read it, you are going to know immediately what I mean, man. I just found myself wanting to read, just one more chapter each time until I finally got to the epic finale. Like every time a chapter would end, and because they're quite short and condensed and bite-sized, they're really easy to get through, despite this book being about 500 pages, something like that. It was a little long, honestly, for what the story is, especially as an origin story. But once you get past that midway slump, it's pretty much all gold, honestly. One of the major issues and themes of this, apart from loss, is the concept of addiction. And this is encapsulated through Winter's character becoming addicted to something called Faltira, which helps her to engage with and enhance her psychic abilities. That's basically what it is, psychic abilities. The way he writes it is quite cool, and the way he presents it as a whole as she's being trained is very, very cool as well. But it's the approach to addiction as a whole which is interesting. He's quite graphic in the detail of it, especially in how he describes the people that Winter sees or has a memory of when her father was taking her through a poor area of a city. Their gaunt faces, their ghastly appearances, skeletal almost in appearance. And I've got a couple of quotes here because I thought it was important to get across just how much Husberg is able to put into this story, the knowledge that he has on this. First quote is from a blog called whatever.scalzi.com. And it's a funny one, somewhat funny considering we're talking about addiction, but his agent said the addiction scenes weren't working and that they felt fake. And Husberg himself has said that he has taken inspiration from his past, which includes addiction. He doesn't go into detail about what that addiction is at any point, not in the research that I could find, and that's fine. That's his business, obviously. But what that does give him the ability to do, it gives him ammunition to be able to speak about it from a personal perspective, as we touched on earlier, taking influence from what you know. And I quote, "You can imagine my surprise when my agent's first notes about Duskfall focused heavily on how the addiction sequences in the novel didn't feel genuine or real at all. I was shocked and a bit bewildered at first, but listening to how my agent described things, I knew he was right. The addiction sequences weren't working. They were disjointed and shallow. I'd let my subconscious include them without thinking deeply about how they should all work together in the story, and that was a mistake. So I went to work." End quote. I have another one here, again, on the addiction. Taken once more from a fantasticallibrarian.com, the interview they did with that. Quote, as to why I chose addiction specifically, well, there are a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's played a significant role in my life and in the lives of some very close friends and loved ones. But I also think the way we often view addiction as a society is at best inaccurate, and at worst so harmful that it perpetuates the problem. Too often in media, addicts are criminalized, demonized, and condemned. My understanding of addiction is very different. Addicts can certainly do criminal, even demonic things, but they are also very, very sick people in need of help. If we can better understand that need for help, I think we'll take a significant step towards helping addicts and those affected by addicts find recovery. End quote. Clearly, there's something that's happened in his past life, and like I say, it's not my business. Chris, if you somehow stumble across this podcast, I've got full respect for you for dealing with this, either helping the people in your life that needed it or helping yourself or in accepting the help, most importantly. But I did find the way that he portrayed this to be a very interesting angle. I've never been addicted to anything like that, drugs or drink, nothing like that. Knock on wood, I never will. But if I ever find myself down that sort of downward spiral, and people do out of nowhere, they never see it coming, and then all of a sudden you're addicted. But it's Winter's gradual descent into the addiction that's so interesting, because she's so adamant she doesn't want to be like the people she saw when she was younger, and yet at the same time she can't stop thinking about it, she can't stop jonesing for it, and then she can't stop lying to the people around her as she keeps taking these crystals just to get a hit of that power again, to feel in control of herself. Because, again, control over yourself, control over other people, control over religion, control over countries, control over politics. Control is another bit of a theme that is addressed or touched upon in here, whether that was on purpose or not. That's certainly something I took from this book. Now, one of the very best things about this book is the ending sequences, like the last couple of scenes, the last couple of chapters as we hurtle towards an epic clash at the end of the book. It really is, for me, I thought it was amazing. The way it was written, the way the action was described, the things that were at stake, the people who were in jeopardy, the tragedy, everything about it was built up accordingly. Again, it had that Final Fantasy vibe, which, as you know by now, I'm a huge fan of. But another thing that I really liked about it, and of course this is spoiler territory right now, but you know that because at the top of the thing, spoilers. It has this Empire Strikes Back-esque tone straight away, and I actually really like that. I mean, some of their party have survived barely, and things have already gone to shit. And this is the end of the first book of what's meant to be 5, and already they're barely getting out of these situations. But just like earlier, like I said earlier with each of the battle scenes, a little part of them dies. They're not the same when they leave as they are when they first get into these altercations. They lost, and the darkness is now loose on the world, which sets up immediate interest for the next books, especially with the fuck-off monsters that come through the portal, and the way they have to bandy together in order to take them out and really push themselves to their fucking limits in order to take them out, using not only a mixture of like telekinesis and strength, but also smarts in order to do it. The ending is great. That sort of dour note where things aren't exactly all peachy for the heroes is wonderful as well, because, I think they say it in Clerks, so now paraphrase here, life isn't a series of upswings, you get the down moments as well, and that was perfectly encapsulated within Empire Strikes Back, and it's something that's echoed within Duskfall here. I mean, I actually have a quote from Chris Husberg about the ending of Duskfall specifically, and this is lifted from the quillery.blogspot.co.uk interview. And the question was, did you have the ending of Duskfall in mind all along? To which he responds, and I quote, "The answer is actually yes and no. One of the things I love about being a discovery writer, pantser, is the sense of organic freedom I have when I'm writing. I definitely had a pretty clear idea of what the ending of Duskfall was going to look like, until I actually started writing the book. The more I wrote, the more my idea of the ending changed, until it became something pretty different from what I'd originally had in mind. And in my opinion, much better." End quote. But yeah, I was a big fan at the ending. I was a big fan once we finally got there. But I was not a big fan consistently throughout. And here's some of the issues I have with Duskfall. 1, There is so much exposition. I cannot stress to you how much exposition there is, especially in the early stages of the book. And I take big issue with this because I do not mind exposition. I'm not one of those dudes that cares too much about the swaths of pages used in something like Lord of the Rings or in a Game of Thrones in order to describe world history or lore or something like that when it's done particularly well. And without being too critical, I do think that the problem isn't necessarily in the way it's presented, but the frequency in which it's presented. You get a concept of a character, they describe the character a little bit, and then you have a couple pages of world building. Then a little bit about more of the personal before more pages of world building. And that, for me, took me out of that quite a bit, very early on. That's just me personally, again. Can't stress that enough, but I did find it a little bit jarring. And I'm not talking about just the beginning. I'm not talking about the prologue going into the first couple chapters. I mean, like the first act of the book was very, very bogged down with exposition and description. Taken from whatever.scalzi.com, and this is a concept, again, about writing what you know. Chris has this to say, quote, "There's a saying in writerdom to, quote, write what you know. As someone who writes speculative fiction, I've always taken this advice with a grain of salt. It can certainly be helpful and potentially very powerful to draw from personal experience and emotion when writing, but I also don't think it's entirely necessary. And the strange truth is, it seems readers often connect with the things I simply research or conjure out of my own imagination far more than the things I've actually experienced." End quote. Yes and no here, Chris. Again, I'm not going to disagree with your quote because that's your opinion. That's fine. Allow me to express mine, of course, to my dear fans out there in podcast land. There's no problem with conjuring things out of your imagination. You're a writer, after all. You're a creator. You're a creator of worlds, just like any writer is, just like any creative person intends to be. But the problem is when you create these worlds and then just, like I say, bog it down. And I understand, this is the first book. The first book needs to set up a whole bunch of stuff, the rules and parameters of the worlds that they exist in, so that the rest of the books then need to adhere to. But I just think that if you had pushed the brake just a little bit, or spread it out just a little bit more across the already somewhat lengthy page count of this book, would have helped it a little bit more and felt less like reading a little bit of an encyclopedia about the world that you're creating, which was one of the major takeaways I had, again, from the first portion of the book. And because of that, honestly, it feels like it takes forever to get going. Easily doesn't get captivating until about halfway through. I mentioned the Navone battle, where all the major characters converge for the first time. That is the first real point I found myself captivated, and it's because of the way that Chris wrote action and how compelling it was. But I found the first half of the book a real slog to commit to due to the heavy and obvious exposition and world building at hand. When asked, Quillery asked him, are you a plotter, a pantser, or a hybrid? And he had this to say, quote, "I used to say that I was pretty much a straight-up pantser, and while that's still mostly true for my standalone series and first novels in a series, my experience writing CQ2 has told me that I'm a bit more of a hybrid than I realize. Most of my formal outlining still takes place after my first draft, but I've begun to use it more and more as a tool to make sure I'm hitting the emotional beats I want each character to experience in the right order at the right time, etc. Turns out I'm definitely not smart enough to hope that those things just happen as I'm writing a 5-book series." End quote. And here's why I chose this plotter versus pantser concept here in relation to the exposition. Obviously, you want to have an arc. You want to have a structure to the book. But to sit down and just go, cool, here's a loose concept of where I want these guys to go. Here I go, start hammering the keyboard. That's what leads to the bogging down with exposition. To keep it a little bit more honed or to go through a couple more, and man, believe me, I know, you don't even need to tell me, I know how many edits this would have gone through. I just feel that a little bit more honing from a plotter standpoint could have helped to sprinkle the entire book, with world lore and world building, rather than so much of it being first thing. And a lot of it, you get the inciting incident very quickly within this book. Within the prologue, Nod is pulled out of the ocean, and the question already is sunk into the reader: who is this person? What is his backstory? What's going on? And that's fine. because that's on a personal issue. The mystery is what brings you back. That J.J. Abrams mystery box concept yet again popping up in something that's not even J.J. Abrams related. I'm a big fan of the mystery box concept, though. But I just think a little less flavoring all in one place, and if sprinkling out across the entire story would have helped the flow of the world building so much more. It would have made it more compelling, make it more bite-sized, make it more palatable, if you will. Now, talking about world building, within this universe is a religious structure, the Cantic religion. And it's interesting. The whole Cantic concept is okay, but the main arc for Jane and Cinzia is clearly steeped and reflected by Mormonism, which happens to be Chris Husberg's own religion. Again, this is something I was able to determine from the research that I've done. And that's not a problem. Obviously, I have no issue with that. You believe what you want to believe in. And the fact that he's had his own personal crisis of faith, and that's inflected upon the story as well, adds a believability to when his characters have their own crisis of faith as well, because he's writing about something he knows, something he's relating to, or finds relatable, should I say. But the whole thing is an entirety, just by the end, again, I know everything keeps going back to, by the end, it all pays off. It does. The whole Cantic religion thing, the gods, the original advocates of Canta, and the concept of demons versus gods, and demons having things to be afraid of as well, is very cool. It's very epic in scale, and it pays off at the end. But it's a long way to get there. Chris has this to say about it, about writing from personal experiences, including his own addictions and crisis of faith, over whatever.scalzi.com, quote, "Writing about personal experiences, especially difficult, profound, and or emotional ones, is one of the bigger challenges I've faced as a writer. Taking specific personal experiences and trying to tell them in such a way that they can be universally applied while still feeling uniquely personal, that's a tough balancing act. But when it works out, the results are pretty incredible," end quote. Now, think of that in relation to his own personal Mormonism, being able to take his own personal experiences and tell them in a universally applied way, which is what he's saying there. He wants to take how he looks at his own faith and then put that through the prism of the Cantic religion and express that through his characters. It's interesting. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just a thing that's there. I didn't find these characters to be the most compelling out of the bunch. Likeable enough, yes, but not necessarily compelling. But I mean, the whole thing where Jane, Cinzia's sister, finds the original scripts, the original texts that only Cinzia is able to translate, despite not knowing the original language that they were written in. She just looks at the language, she just looks at the tablets or whatever they are, and is able to immediately translate. But nobody else can look upon them. They have to do it from behind a sheet. I've watched that episode of South Park where they make fun of the Mormon religion, and I know enough about Mormonism through, just everyday research, things I've come across, things like that. Not that I've ever gone out of my way to extensively research Mormonism, I have to say. So Chris will always be the expert in here, considering he is a Mormon. But that, there's no difference here between finding those plates and only Joseph Smith being allowed to look at them and translate them himself, and everybody just having to take his word for it. I mean, how does that not lift completely from what you know? That is the antithesis of taking what you know and writing about it. And it just so happens to be through this religion, the Cantic religion. Again, I just found it as a really interesting point, to obviously see an element of write what you know and putting it into your story, but using a religion that's so obviously similar to the one that you yourself are familiar with. Now, this book, as I've alluded to already, it's intended as a quintet, and it is written specifically because of that. Now, what that means is, like I said earlier, there's too much exposition, too much world building in an obvious manner, ready to set up for the other 4 books that are going to come out in this series. Everything about this just alludes to the things that will come later. Some things are answered within the course of the 500 pages that this book encapsulates. There's a lot more questions to get thrown up later, and the ending, especially as epic as it is one of those endings like, oh, what comes next? You better wait around, because God forbid everything gets fucking tied up in one book, The writing style has a habit. Oh, this is something actually, sorry, just looking at my notes. This is something that really bothered me. And if you do come to read this book, I'd love to know if you felt the same way. The writing style, although very good, has a habit of really telling you, the reader, how the character is feeling. And I mean this in a way that it is way too direct, causing the writing to have to lack any sort of subtlety on a more personal level for those characters. Character monologues occasionally flat out tell you how they're feeling, and it comes across as babying and unnatural. It's like you're not trusting the audience to really be able to read deeper into what these characters' thoughts really truly mean, or how they're acting. If somebody's giving somebody the cold shoulder, what does that mean? Is it because they're cold towards that person, don't like them, or is there something deeper on a deeper level happening there? We don't need it spelled out every single time, and that is something that definitely happens in this book, coupled with way too much reiteration of concepts of feelings. I spoke about some of the grander themes earlier, especially one of addiction, and how Winter saw these people when her father took her through a poor part of town, and they're all addicted and whatnot. That gets mentioned a whole bunch between the first time and the last page. Prepare to reread basic concepts time and time again, just in case you forgot. And that really, really bothered me. This constant reminding of character feelings, of character fears, of their goals and their ambitions, of what they're trying to achieve, is a constant touchstone, a constant callback. Just trust the audience to remember. Just trust the audience that they can dig a little deeper, that they're smart enough. Most people that, firstly, they're readers, so they're obviously not going to be stupid. Two, they're fans of they're fans of fantasy and or dark fiction, so they're aware of how this stuff works on a grander scheme anyway. Most of your audience is going to be pretty intelligent, and I just found that this constant reiteration and the way that he would literally spell out almost what their motivations are and how they're feeling, I didn't like that. I'm not going to say that was insulting or to the point of insulting. It's just something that really grated me, that I didn't enjoy because of how many times it happened. And one of the big major issues from a story perspective that I had at the very, very end, and this really jumped off the page to me when I saw this, it specifically states that that was needed was tiellan blood, right? They basically, the Rhodanese manipulate Nott into returning back to them as a return protocol, because they help create him. He's imbued with multiple different souls, which is why he remembers so many different things, is able to defend himself in such a effective way, is because he is like a golem. He's imbued with life, but with 10 different spirits, whatever it is. And by him going there, by him being allowed to be tricked and returning back to the castle, he brings with him some tiellans, Winter, Leanne, so on and so forth. And in doing so, he's allowed the Harbinger, Winter, for they believe her to be the Harbinger of the end, into the castle in order to try and sacrifice her. And it's like they go through this whole shtick, this whole plan in order to get them all there so they can grab her and sacrifice her, when it is specifically stated that any tiellan would have done. Seriously. All the hard work to manipulate the entire party. Why didn't they just... I don't get this. The bad guys could have just jumped on the first tiellan within their city, or just kidnapped the first tiellan that they saw, brought them into the castle, and then sacrificed them and used their blood, in order to call forth the demons, call forth the darkness. I found this particular plot point to be completely nonsensical, and probably one of the only really major points where I read it and I was in somewhat of disbelief, because I just found it to be so... Like, how does that happen? Why did that happen? If it's true that they could have used any tiellan, the whole journey that Nott takes there, what was the point? Why did they need Nott there? They didn't, they don't even really need Nott there at all. It's just a curious, maybe he'll come back to us. And then they hear about him getting married, a human getting married to tiellan in the area that they lost him, and so they put two and two together. That's why they first sent their squad out there in order to interrupt the wedding at the very, very beginning of the book. If you recall, I mentioned that earlier on in the show. But if Nott didn't traverse back there, and he didn't bring either Winter or Leanne with him, in fact, let's go extreme. None of them are there at any point. right? The bad guys could have saved themselves weeks, days, months, years of waiting, just kidnapped the first tiellan, made the sacrifice, and opened up the portal. It was a major sticking point for me when I read that. But nothing compares to this. This next point is the biggest problem I have with this book. It's one of the problems that I have that make it difficult to connect with this book and to connect with the main character, which I mentioned about earlier, him being a bit whiny, a bit moany, a bit unlikable, a bit plain, a bit 2D, a bit brushstroke, okay? This book is basically a fantasy set Jason Bourne concept. Not as Jason Bourne for the longest while. Something that is, of course, addressed and explained as the story develops, but it doesn't change the fact that you've seen this before. This is a story we are all familiar with. I mean, he even says this. Christopher Husberg even says this, taken from forcesofgeek.com. He lists out a couple of books, I think 5 books that help influence Duskfall, and one of them was one of the Bourne Identity. I think it was Bourne Identity or one of the Bourne books. And he says, quote, "My new pitch for Duskfall, and one that works pretty well to this day, became, you guessed it, Jason Bourne in a fantasy world," end quote. I don't necessarily think that's something... I don't think that's really a good thing, because as soon as I started reading it, you could look at the page and look at the screen with the Bourne Identity on and be like, yeah, this is identical. Fished out of the ocean, doesn't know who he is, has to reestablish his own life as he pieces back fragments of a memory to understand where he came from, who he is, what his motivation is, what his purpose is. We have seen this, and it's done in a much better, more well-paced way with the Bourne stuff than it is over this book, because, like I say, this book really doesn't pick off until the Battle of Navone, which is about halfway, maybe just over halfway through the story itself. Not being Jason Bourne really, really sticks in my craw. It really bothers me, and the problem is, of course, this is that comprises the inciting incident. That's the major thing that's meant to get its hooks into you, and it's one of the major compelling driving forces narratively that sees people leave the status quo and go and experience an adventure new. Winter follows not. Because he leaves her on the wedding day due to the mystery of where these men came from and the fact he feels that he knows them or knows that they're connected in some way. That mystery compels him to leave. Winter leaves in order to follow. Leon follows her because of her following him. Everything is based off of this, and it's everything that we've seen before. It was just something that I couldn't really get over, per se, and maybe that's just me. There are hundreds of thousands of amnesia stories out there. I'm fully aware. It's just the way that started off so similar. Literally it's like the pre-credit sequence of a movie, the way it was fished out, and then you just imagine the flashy title sequence going off before finally a year later Knots tying the hook. Tying the knot, no pun intended, with Winter. It bothered me. And is, like I say, probably the worst thing about this book to me is not as his main focus being that amnesia Jason Bourne type character coupled with the pacing of the first half. But the question, of course, is this story officially too sweet or officially just not sweet enough? I've looked at things from both sides. I've listed out a whole bunch of pros. I listed out a whole bunch of cons. And so all that's left is to wrap it up for you. And these are my final departing thoughts on Duskfall by Chris Husberg. Honestly, I'm just like always, guys, just like always, because you are my friend. And we're, like I say, just like having a cup of coffee and discussing this new book I read or this new film I watched, this new TV series that I just enjoyed seeing. I want to share it with you, and I'm always going to be honest in the best way possible, the best of my abilities. It's difficult for me to gauge where I fall with this book. This is probably the hardest thing I've had to grade with Sweet Story Bro. I mean, on the one hand, it took an age for me to become invested in these characters and their struggles, both the micro and the macro of what they have to go through. As I mentioned, it easily took until just past halfway through the book, if not slightly more, for the pacing to really pick up due to the writing being labored with heavy exposition and world building. And hey, I have nothing against world building, but I don't think Duskfall had much subtlety in how it achieved its development with that. You couple that with the near constant reiteration of every character's major issues and dilemmas. Seriously, if you read this book, you will see that every chapter has at least one recap of sorts somewhere hidden within it. And it can become a little tiresome to read. However, once the world is built and the stakes are clear, the book really, really finds its footing. The characters gel and become fleshed out as their lives become intertwined with a mission that unites them, much in the same way, like I say, that any Final Fantasy game plays out. And by the end, I was finally invested in these people and what their core goals were. Even the obviously Mormon-inspired translation of the ancient texts with Cinzia and Jane. It's just such a shame it takes so fucking long to get there. That's what really makes rating this book difficult for me. It's like, how can I break it down? It's like recommending a TV series to a friend, right? Like let's say something that's 12 episodes, 22, 24 episodes long. Recommending them something, but letting them know as you're handing over the DVD box set that it doesn't really get good until episode 15. Like, that's a really long commitment of time to finally get to the good stuff, man. All that stuff before, just plodding along, builds the world, we understand, we get it, until you finally get to the good stuff. And honestly, Duskfall is the same in that regard. And so, for the first time, I find deciding whether this story is officially too sweet or just not sweet enough actually quite difficult. For those willing to put in the time and have a love of fantasy, Duskfall does have an amazing payoff and skyrockets after the midway point. But for those that want something to immediately grip them and keep you captivated throughout, in my opinion, Duskfall tries. God love it. It does try, especially with the movie-ass beginning, trying to get that exciting incident in as early as possible. But for me, honestly, it just fails to do so. Instead of feeling like a watered-down, worst of all, predictable fantasy version of Jason Bourne. Honestly, I am interested to know where the story goes next, which is a testament to the pacing and climax Husberg is able to deliver finally come the ending. But the journey there is a long slog, albeit one filled with somewhat interesting characters, especially Astrid. If this show didn't deal with absolutes as a scoring system, this story, I would put it at maybe a 6 or a 7, which to me is still a recommendation, still worth your time. However, we don't do that on this podcast. And this is so difficult because I really, really did love the ending. I really did. Again, once you get past the halfway point, Duskfall by Chris Husberg, the first of the Chaos Queen Quintet, is officially just not sweet enough. Though, like I said, I'm still intrigued to see where it goes. And that's going to do it for another episode of Sweet Story Bro, guys. Thank you so much for listening, and be sure to let me know what you think on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, email, whatever you want, man. Do you agree or disagree with the points that I've made over the course of this review? I want to know. And you can do it by emailing me or tweeting me or whatever. And if you want to check out the story yourself, why not? Like I said, it does get really, really good by the end. And hey, you may pick it up and be immediately grabbed by the first few pages in a way that I wasn't. Different folks, different strokes and whatnot. You can by going to sweetstorybro.com and clicking on the Amazon links in order to buy it. Again, doesn't cost you any extra. You'll get that book delivered straight to your door, and a percentage goes back to me so I can invest more into the show. No more expensive, kicks back a percentage. Remember that. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube so you don't miss any future sweet updates regarding the state of the show or the Unguarded retrospective, which we're going to be getting back on pretty soon at this point in time of recording, of course. And I gotta say, if you like the episode, why not leave a tip? A couple bucks, less than a cup of coffee, and it helps the show exponentially. I cannot stress to you how much of a one-man band this show is. So any form of support is greatly appreciated, whether it's through a tip like you might do with a Twitch guy. Because if those Twitch dudes can get tips, why not the people that put so much love and attention into the content they create for podcasts as well, man? And you can help out with a small donation of your choice to paypal.me/sweetstorybro. That's paypal.me/sweetstory, bro. You hit up the link, you put in how much you want to donate to help the show, click send, and feel good for the rest of the day because a good deed was done, my friend. As I always say during the outro of these shows as well, be sure to share the show with your story-loving friends too. Share the love and spread the conversation. Maybe you know somebody who's read this book or is a big Chris Husberg fan that may be interested in listening to this review. Send it their way. Don't just see it and then sit on it, man. Send it out. Let other people hear it. See if they have the same opinion as me or if they want to debate me on the finer points of what I've had to say. I'm all for it, either which way. So until next time, guys, as always, please be sure to keep your eyes on Twitter. Follow, if you haven't already, at Sweet Story Bro, so that you can get the Monday mention. In case you aren't aware, every 2 weeks this show comes out. So what happens on the Monday when the show isn't coming out? I'll tell you what. I release information about what the story for the next week will be. So you can read that book, you can watch that movie, you can read those comics, or whatever it happens to be, ready for that show. So until next time, man. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. Thank you so much for checking out last week's episode. Thank you so much for checking out the next episode. And until next time, please, I implore you, man, go enjoy some stories. I'm out. Hey, if you enjoyed today's review on Christopher Husberg's novel Duskfall, and there's enough in there from the pros and the cons that piques your interest that you maybe want to check it out, hey, have I got a deal for you. If you head over to audibletrial.com/sweetstorybro, you can pick yourself up a free copy of the audiobook of Duskfall. We all live busy lives, man, so why not have somebody read to you? In this case, Adam Werner uses his dulcet tones and wonderful voice in order to tell you the story of Duskfall. Not only can you get a free audiobook of your choice by going to audibletrial.com/sweetstorybro, you also get a 30-day free trial membership to see if you like what they're all about. So don't delay, man. Get something free today.